Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Pulse. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Asad Ahmed. Asad, very nice to have you with us.
Good to be here. Thank you, Saeeda.
So, Asad, an illustrious career, 35 years in banking, 3 continents, CEO of 2 banks. You really have had as we would say, a well-trodden path.
So it's been a wonderful innings, and you're right. It's been in various parts of the world and various things to do, and it's for the most part it's been a lot of fun, a lot of learning, and a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed myself.
Excellent. And then 2020, March, COVID. How has
Yes.
this compared to the other ups and downs that you've seen?
So I'm sure that everyone's saying we've never seen anything like this before, and so putting all that aside, I think it's been to me it's been a lot of learning. So I think it started with obviously in individual issues. You can't do things, you can't go out, but as this thing has progressed, um, I've been able to see a lot of resilience. I've
Mm.
been see a lot of good side of people coming out to help, and I've also been able to see that how lucky we are in our parts of the world to have the resources and the medical facilities, etc., to be able to tackle it well. So to me, it has given a different perspective um, of life and things that are more important than others.
Absolutely. And what about the banking industry? How do you think COVID has impacted the banking industry globally, but also specifically locally and regionally?
Correct. So I think we're yet to see the impact, and the impacts will come in many forms. I think they will come, of course, and we'll speak about them. They'll come in the form of performance of banks,
Hmm.
but more importantly, I think there is a need to reevaluate where banking is headed. In terms of the things, for example, there were sectors of the economy which we thought were going to be resilient and were sort of bulletproof. And those sectors, such as health, such as education,
Yeah.
such as consumer retail,
Yes.
those seem to have been very severely impacted. So I think bankers will have to learn to do these things differently and understand what kind of product programs they carry forward, what kind of operational resilience, what kind of the rules of the game have changed.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's something that they'll need to evaluate.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Indeed, the rules of the game have changed, and it's quite difficult because one of the few things in banking that is done in a very rigorous, data-driven manner is assessing the risk, underwriting,
Yes,
trying to use historic data to try and project out what future credit losses could be, what may come. And now we find ourselves in this discontinuity where the past is no longer a good predictor of the future. So I wonder, is this something that a lot of the banks have really gotten their heads around? Have they started to make the changes that will be necessary to now define the future programs? Or are we still at the point where, we're dealing with the reality of today, because the reality of today is it's taken quite a bit to deal with.
correct. It's still early in the cycle for us to be able to make a full conclusion. I think conversations have started, but I don't think banks are globally are in a
Yeah.
position yet to be able to determine what the next steps are going to be like. In the region, we offer a very singular product with banks. So our balance sheet is essentially what we work with, and the balance sheet has very specific products that have been coming over a number of years. There has been some innovation in the product line, but those are really not gigantic leaps. Those are leaps within the existing product ranges that we have. And
Mm.
I think when you speak of the underwriting standards, you're absolutely right. The past is no longer a predictor, but also the rules of how we underwrote credit have changed.
Yeah.
So whether an existing product program we will work with the same set of parameters, with the same set of variables, I think it will not be possible. I think that, so we'll have to fundamentally rewrite the way we look at risk.
So we're looking at new risk models, credit models, and based on very little data and information, possibly harnessing the power of big data and the informatics that exists.
I think an intelligent use of information and being able to sift through what is critical and what is not within big data will be important. What will also be important is levels of capitalization that banks carry. What will also be important is, are institutions fundamentally sound to be able to go through cycles? And this was clearly, a deep and came out of nowhere. But I think what it will do is make sure, the regulators would like to make sure that institutions are strong enough to weather subsequent cycles as they come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, if we look at the overall, I mean, you raised a very good point around the capitalization levels. And indeed, we need very healthy buffers, healthy numbers in order to weather what we have. And if you look at what is out there, if you look at some of the numbers, and I'm just looking at the latest numbers in our pulse, the capital adequacy ratios are still quite healthy. They're, from last quarter, they're up, they're at 17.6, but the top 10 banks in the UAE, still quite healthy for the ones in Saudi, which should be out soon. If I keep this in mind, but I also think about in the news the last few weeks and months, I keep hearing and we keep reading about banks raising more tier one capital, more AT1 in terms of loans. So how do you reconcile the two? Is there enough capital? Do we need more capital? I mean, what is this incoming additional capital being used for? Why is it in this form? I would love to hear some thoughts around that.
Sure. So, look, over the years, the capitalization levels of the CAR ratios in this region have been consistently higher than the West. And that's great because it's always good to have more capital. But a number of things are happening. One is, if you look also at the numbers that have come out, we will be seeing that the return on equity and the return of the assets, banks are generally beginning to decline. They're now into single digits on the return on equity, where we've been used to days of 15 and 16%. So I think that there will be conversations happening in boardrooms across the region as to when is a good time for some consolidation to occur within respective markets. So there is enough liquidity in the system, and I think banks have taken good advantage. There's been a number of issuances of tier one capital, or CET1, and I think that's a good thing, because not only does it improve their ratios, but it also gives them buffers to withstand any further deterioration that might occur within their books in the next 6 months or 9 months. My feel is that this deterioration will continue and possibly into the first quarter of 2021 before we see any reversals.
One other trend that we've seen in banking in the last 2-3 years in the region has been around digitization of banks, launching new digital-only banks, and really focusing on creating a flexible, digital, nimble backbone to try and to really bring this to the forefront, not only from a customer proposition point of view, but also from an operating model point of view.
Yes.
So to tap into new markets, provide new products, new customers, but at the same time, do it at a much lower cost and in a much more scalable manner than would otherwise be seen. Given this investment, do you think where we are today, banks are, they've actually done quite a bit of work, and as a result of that, they've been able to weather some of the stormy weather a little bit better? Or do you think there's still a bit of work that needs to be done in that area?
Fair question. So I think what we've seen, and digital started, of course, in Europe first, in UK. So what we've seen is that setting up a new digital bank is simpler than, and I'm not talking about the revenue loss models, but just in terms of the operating model, is simpler than digitizing a bank. or than taking an existing bank digitized. So, I think this issue is the same here. Banks have spent a fair bit of money in the last several years. Some have provided numbers, some have not. We have not seen any analysis, and anecdotal evidence also provides for the same, whether they have managed to put the operating costs or start to control the operating costs in a manner to directly link it to the digital side that's happening. Some of the research that's come out seems to indicate that if you latch on a digital bank, if you like, on top of your existing core and on top of the many surround systems that you have here. So banks today operate on a number of systems. Yes, you have a core, but no one bank just maintains a core. So they'll have a platform for credit, they'll have a platform for this, platform for that. And then on top of that, you're putting a digital layer. So what you're actually doing in the short term is you're actually adding on to your cost. You're adding on to your operating cost so that you can maintain one more level of an add-on. And when you're adding that cost on, the effect of that may come at a future date, but we haven't seen that yet. But also the whole concept of digital in the region is different. It's different from bank to bank, and what exactly does digital mean? And we've seen much more emphasis on the front end, and then we've seen at actually digitizing processes or being digitally native in the way you think. And so not just taking on the old system and saying now because I can do it on my phone, I'm now digital. But it's so I think we have a long way to go, and so there are a number of digital banks that are now being spoken about. The UAE is, I think, has initially licensed, done a provisional license of its first digital bank. There are banks coming up in Saudi, there are banks in Bahrain, but we've not yet seen a fully working digital model.
Indeed, there tends to be, as you said, a lot of interfaces and interlinkages with legacy infrastructure, legacy systems, legacy core even, and that definitely tends to complicate things. And at some point, there ends up being the human element and the human interaction. And unless that is digitized and taken care of, it's not you're not going to get the efficiencies and the saves. And you're right, it's very challenging because by their very nature, banks are more risk averse. They're more they like to be monolithic, and it's to disintermediate that, to pull that out, and to try to create a different model it is often very, very challenging. So I fully agree with you, and I think it's something we see time and time again.
Time and again. So just as an anecdote, we obviously no names, but we spent 2 days wanting to speak with the CEO and his reports on digital transformation of a bank. And it took us 2 days of full day working sessions for this team to actually agree what digital meant for that institution. So before we even got somewhere as to what we're going to transform, if you don't know where we want to get to.
Yeah. And I think, look, that's exactly right. I think there's as many interpretations of what digital means as there are people at any given point in the day, right? And we all learn and constantly evolve as we go along, because it is a nebulous space, and it is ever changing and ever evolving. So that's probably one of the reasons why it's so difficult for organizations to get it right. Because there haven't been too many boards or management teams that we've spoken with where they say, no, digital is not important, or it's not one of the top 3 priorities for us this year, or it's something we're focusing on, right? That's never the case. It's always the case where digital is one of the top 3 priorities. They want to get things done. So the spirit is very willing, but for some reason, the actual translation of that into producing a digitally capable, transformed bank it doesn't happen.
No, you're absolutely right. It doesn't happen. I think the intent is very much there, and it's they want to work at it. But sometimes I think a practical understanding of what it actually means is missing. And everybody wants to be at the end game without sort of getting a feel of what's all the steps that have to be taken in the middle. And it's never a straight line, because the way that the world is working, the way digital world is working especially, is that there's going to be constant variations. So you have to be comfortable with um, with a version of what is good, as opposed to trying to get to the best, because that best will always be changing.
That's exactly right. Again, in banking, there's so much time and effort spent on getting the process right, codify it, put it in policies and procedures, and then let's roll it out. Whereas by its very nature, digital is not that. It's ever changing. So fully agree. And I think the other thing that we've seen is digital is as much about the bits, the numbers, the hard infrastructure, the core, the systems, as it is about the people.
Yes.
Right? As it is about the culture, as it is about the groups working together and changing their mindset. So I wonder if that's, that's another impediment that we don't always spend as much time and effort on as we need to, or as we should, in order to get a real thorough and sustainable and sticky transformation.
Look, I think it makes sense. And where there have been successful models, ING, DBS, where digital banks have worked and have done well, even though there was an existing bank on the side, they have done it separately. It's much more difficult to take an existing bank and start digitizing it and hope that you will get to the same end result, as opposed to starting something and letting it work on the side, because the model and the culture is just very different.
At the very least, create a ring-fenced team and then try and do it that way, as opposed to any other way. Yeah, no, fully agree. Absolutely. But if I bring it back to, I guess, some of the results that we're seeing in our pulse, in our recent numbers, I think a lot of what we talked about, the capital adequacy, the ratios, the profitability shrinkage, we see that. The one thing that we don't really see in some of the numbers is on the cost of risk. The cost of risk is actually relatively stable, relatively healthy. So if I look at it, last quarter, it was trending at around 1.4%. This quarter, it's trending at about 1.3%. So what this more or less implies is that, yes, we've been talking about changes in the market, a lot of, let's say, angst in the system, but we're not really seeing this in the numbers yet.
So the cost of risk is a combination of a couple of things, which you'll see as we all know in the Pulse document. But essentially, the primary component there is provisioning. And in terms of, and that, of course, is a reflection of your loan book.
Yes.
So we are also seeing that the coverage ratios of banks in terms of their NPLs, those have declined from the first quarter to the second and even the third. So in the third quarter, at the end of third quarter, we find that 7 out of 10 banks in the UAE are no longer have a coverage ratio of 100, which means that whatever the provisions they've taken no longer are sufficient, as from a simple perspective, in terms of their NPL. And so if it were to be done, I think the cost of risk would be higher. So the other issue is, of course, on the test program. So the test program, which I think the Central Bank of the UAE, came out one of the first ones out of the block to support the economy. And I think they've done a great job. They've put in about 160 billion dirhams. But, you can only do that up to a point. So the test program is supposed to expire on December 31st. The top 10 banks have availed about 51 billion dirhams in the test program, which means they've given forbearance or extensions to their customers. It is when this program ends, and unless extended, it'll end in December. Yeah. Out of this 51 billion, some of it is going to come back, and some of it will be performing, some will be less so. So first quarter of next year, we should see some effect of the test program closing down. So the cost of risk in the first quarter, we should see an uptick as well in it. So I think with that, and with the more provisioning method perhaps will be done at the end of this year, we will see a return back of cost of risk to go up.
Okay. And what would that mean for the companies and the organizations that would typically take some of the financing from the banks? Does it mean that it will be a bit more difficult for them? Does it mean that the financing will be more expensive? How should they start thinking about this as they make plans for the next year?
So there is enough liquidity in the system, and I think the central bank has ensured that. Um, uh, Rates have been relatively flat as in borrowing rates as well. I think they're linked to the interbank, unless there is an upsurge in interbank rates and unless the rates in the US and hence this part of the world go up. I think borrowing rates will increase, but in my personal view, I don't think they will increase it of a nature that should be effective. The question is whether banks will continue to be lenders and now on their own steam without test support, and that one hopes that that will be so. It's very important for liquidity to stay within the system because the only way economy is going to move is if there's enough liquidity and enough credit available, and I think that's very critical going forward.
Looking forward, if we bring out your crystal ball, what do you think? What do you see in the next few months? How do you see the banking sector shaping up?
Well, the way I think it would be helpful for the banking sector to shape up is with some consolidation. We have 21 banks in local banks in the Emirates. We have, I think, just over 60 listed banks in the GCC. 61 listed banks for a population of the size of GCC, by most definitions, is a big number. And I think from a regulatory perspective, it's better to have stronger, fewer banks than a number of less performing smaller banks, because I think it strengthens the regulatory regime and it strengthens the general economic framework. So no crystal ball, but I think that will probably be a helpful direction for banks to go. And of course, continued real investment in actually bringing down costs linked to digitization.
Okay, very clear. Now, if you for a second, Asa, take off your, let's say, consulting hat and put back on your executive hat, right? What would be your, let's say, words of wisdom to those that are out there in the industry at the helms of a lot of these banks and struggling with a lot of things that we've just talked about?
Yes.
What is it that they can do to prepare for the next few months? Where is it that they can maybe selectively focus on to try and make sure that we get to the best outcome over the 2021?
Let me just take one step back, if I may. And this is one of the good things about A&M is that, and especially more so in this region and in the other regions, that of the 5,000 people that we have in the firm, we have a combination of practitioners and we have a combination of consultants. So, and we're, you and I come from different worlds, and I think that's worked out extremely well because the mindset and the way you look at a problem, the way you approach it is very different. But to be able to combine the thought process and then to be able to implement it, that makes a big difference. And we've seen this, in our practices in, well, of course, financial services, but healthcare and education, etc. So I've been lucky to have been on both sides, and the only counsel I can give from this side or from my consulting, from my banking side, is I think there is the mind has to be really open. The solutions that, as a practitioner, that I thought I had were there, but there is much more than what one knows. So I think it's important to surround yourself with people who are brighter than yourself, who are more experienced in different ways, to be able to expand the thinking within the management teams of institutions. And when I look at the management teams and the boards of financial institutions in the region, sometimes I find nothing has changed. there have been the same people for 20, 30 years. And um, I think that's probably not helpful.
Mm.
I think it's important to have constantly have new thinking and constantly have people who can bring entirely different mindset to be able to the table. And you may arrive at a totally different answer, which is a better answer than what one might think one had.
So open yourself up to, I guess, lots of different points of views, and then, I guess, deliberately, slowly think through what, frankly, could work, even if it is something out of your comfort zone.
Absolutely. I think living in the comfort zone is just a recipe for not getting anywhere.
No, makes a lot of sense. Indeed. So, Asad, you've been in the region, specifically in the UAE, since 1984. You were part of the original team that set up NBF. You eventually went on to become the CEO at NBF, and then we moved on to do many other things. How has the industry, in your view, evolved over the last 30 years, 40 years in the GCC? How, and the UAE? How have banking institutions and organizations developed from when you were first
Yes,
here to where we are today?
it was a long time ago. So, and then I took the 10-year break in between and went off to CIBC in Toronto. Um, so, look, I think the banking industry in the region has come an extremely long way. I think it's been both from a technology perspective, from an output perspective. A lot of the change, though, in my mind, has been driven from outside. So the change has been reactive as opposed to from within, which is okay. And because the world outside, from a compliance framework, from a product framework, and from an information framework, has had so many inflection points within for the banks here that the pace of change had to improve. Still room to go, I think. But I think there will be things which will be outside the control of banks. So, for example, if you take things like payments, so 7, 8 years ago, there were only two people who made payments. There was Visa and MasterCard. Today, there's a world of payments. Payments is an whole industry, and so for many, in many ways, banks have been disintermediated from the payments. I think the same will happen with foreign exchange for an individual at an individual remittance level. I think trade finance is also something that banks may have to pick up their skills on, or redo their skills, because now with Basel III and the capital allocations to trade finance, we can see banks exiting from trade finance.
Yes.
So I think small business loans, small loans, micro loans, which can be done digitally, and we've seen a lot of that in Africa and in the Far East. So I think that the specific products within the portfolios will be increasingly at risk. So for banks, banks will need to start thinking as to where they're going to make their beachheads, where they're going to do their banking going forward, because the world's not going to stop.
Indeed. Though it's not going to stop, and it's going to look very, very different. So
very different.
Disrupt or be disrupted. Absolutely. Absolutely. So we talked about the UAE and the GCC. We talked about Canada. We skipped over the part where you spend quite a bit of time in Kenya. And you are probably the only person that I know who has the Order of the Grand Warrior from Kenya. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Sure. So that's a civil award, which is, I guess, on the third family of awards from the top. Kenya is a delightful place. I really enjoyed being there. The work was great. I went there to run a bank, and it was it's partially owned by the government of Dubai, so that's how I found myself there. I spent a couple of years there. It needed a lot of work, so the work was done. But one of the things that, and it's a Sharia compliant bank, a Gulf African bank, and one of the things that we focused on was to bring a lot of first-time bank customers who were not banking with the traditional banks because they were not Sharia compliant. But we also did a lot of work to bring women and women entrepreneurs into financial inclusion. So I guess as part of the turnaround and part of bringing what they said, the vulnerable into financial inclusion, they were gracious enough to award this Order of the Grand Warrior. So yeah, it was
Wonderful.
Nice of them.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today, Asad. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here.
Thank you being here, and wonderful to have had this conversation.
Thank you.